Hello and welcome to Paranormal Teach. Today we are talking about the real-life Stranger Things. When people talk about the real-life Stranger Things, they're usually referring to two very different pieces of American history. One is fully documented and verified through declassified files, congressional hearings, and survivor testimony, Project MKUltra. The other exists only in conspiracy claims and fringe books, the Montauk Project. But both shape the world we see in Stranger Things, and the real stories are far more layered than many people realize. Let's begin with the documented side, MKUltra. To understand why it existed, you have to go back to the early Cold War. The United States believed that the Soviet Union, China, and North Korea were researching psychological conditioning, brainwashing, and chemical interrogation. After American prisoners of war returned from Korea and some repeated communist propaganda, U.S. officials assumed that enemy governments had discovered methods of controlling the human mind. Whether those assumptions were accurate or exaggerated didn't matter. They created pressure inside intelligence agencies to act. Out of this fear, the CIA launched MKUltra in 1953. The program eventually expanded into 149 sub-projects across more than 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, and psychiatric centers. Most of the time, the institutions did not even know that the CIA was involved. The agency funneled money through shell organizations to hide its tracks. The goals of MKUltra were broad and disturbing. The CIA wanted to understand whether human behavior could be influenced, altered, weakened, or directly controlled. They were searching for new interrogation methods, truth serums, chemicals that could confuse or disorient enemies, and ways to break down psychological defenses. They also experimented with whether hypnosis, sensory deprivation, or hallucinogenic drugs could make someone more suggestible or compliant. Ultimately, they wanted tools that could be used in intelligence operations, interrogations, and psychological warfare. These goals were not theoretical. They produced very real experiments on very real people, many of whom could not consent or did not even know they were being used as test subjects. One example comes from Subproject 42 at the Addiction Research Center in Kentucky. Prisoners with substance use disorders were given LSD every day for 77 days straight, sometimes in increasing doses, to study how long-term exposure affected the brain. Some prisoners also received heavy drug combinations and electroshock. Because they were incarcerated and dependent on the institution, they were among the most vulnerable people that the CIA could have possibly experimented on. Another case comes from Subproject 130, which explored sensory deprivation. Participants were placed in isolation chambers with no sound, no light, and minimal movement for extended periods. After hours or days of isolation, they were given hallucinogens to see if the altered state made their minds easier to influence. These sessions became the real-world inspiration for the sensory deprivation tank used in Stranger Things when Eleven enters altered states. There's also the infamous story of Frank Olson, a military scientist working with the CIA. Olson was secretly dosed with LSD by his colleagues in 1953 without his knowledge. Within days, he experienced confusion, paranoia, and a rapid psychological decline. He later fell to his death from a hotel window in New York. While officially ruled a suicide, later investigations from the Rockefeller Commission revealed troubling contradictions and raised serious concerns about CIA accountability. Olson's family eventually received an apology and a settlement from the U.S. government. MKUltra also used unsuspecting civilians. In Operation Midnight Climax, the CIA rented apartments in New York and San Francisco and hired sex workers to lure men to these safe houses. The men were secretly dosed with LSD, while CIA agents watched their reactions through one-way mirrors. The goal was to see whether drugs could be used for blackmail, interrogation, or disorientation. The scope of these experiments was so vast and so secretive that when the Watergate scandal threatened to expose intelligence programs in the early 1970s, CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most MKUltra files destroyed. Only about 20,000 pages survived by accident because they were misfiled. These surviving documents eventually surfaced during the Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission investigations, which concluded that MKUltra violated basic human rights and scientific ethics, prompting reforms in federal research regulations. Now that's the documented half of the real Stranger Things. The other half is the Montauk Project, a conspiracy story that caught fire in the 1980s and 1990s. Unlike MKUltra, there are no government documents, no eyewitness verification, and no physical evidence supporting these claims, but the lore became enormously influential nonetheless. The Montauk Project story centers around Camp Hero, a decommissioned Air Force radar base in Montauk, New York. In books by Preston Nichols and Peter Moon, Nichols claims he recovered memories revealing that secret underground labs beneath the base conducted experiments in the late 1970s and early 80s. These alleged experiments focused on psychic warfare, remote viewing, mind amplification, electromagnetic manipulation, and even time travel. Nichols described a device called the Montauk Chair, which he claimed enhanced psychic projection through electromagnetic fields. According to his story, children often referred to as Montauk boys were used in experiments because they supposedly had stronger psychic abilities. He alleged that some of these children were abducted, groomed, and trained for telepathic tasks. He also claimed that one experiment went catastrophically wrong when amplified psychic energy manifested a monstrous creature that appeared physically on the base before retreating into a portal. These dramatic accounts have been dismissed by historians, government officials, and former military personnel. Camp Hero has been inspected repeatedly with no evidence of any underground laboratories. Still, the imagery, abandoned radar towers, Cold War architecture, rumors of sealed-off tunnels made Montauk fertile ground for conspiracy storytelling. The creators of Stranger Things were inspired enough by these tales that the show was actually originally titled Montauk and set on Long Island. Many of the supernatural elements, especially Eleven's psychic abilities and the idea of government agents weaponizing the mind, come directly from this folklore. When you put all of this together, the inspiration behind Stranger Things becomes clear. The show draws its realism and psychological horror from MKUltra, the verified program that used hallucinogens, sensory deprivation, and unethical experiments on vulnerable people. And it draws its supernatural, otherworldly elements from the Montauk Project, the myth about psychic children, electromagnetic devices, and dimensional rifts. One half is documented history, one half is cultural mythology, and together they form the eerie foundation behind the real-life Stranger Things, reminding us that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that start with a shred of truth and grow into something much larger in our collective imagination.